Steve Crane is an executive recruiter. Over 6 years ago, he started his practice for one purpose: to use his experience as a former public company CFO, board member, and leader in corporate finance and accounting structures to help private equity firms and other global companies and their executives be fast, adaptable, and strategic. Steve does these podcasts to inspire and inform, but more importantly, they're a focused platform to help business leaders grow. You've made it to the C-suite.
In this episode, Jeff Colton, CEO of LÍLLÉbaby, shares his story of how he worked his way into the CEO role and how he builds a strong team.
Tell us a little bit about your background and how you moved up into that coveted CEO role.
Sure. So my background is in kind of branded consumer products. I grew up at a great company called Callaway Golf in the golf business and manufacturer of golf equipment based here in Carlsbad. And then, always kind of a product and marketing kind of background and perspective on things, and a degree in physics and engineering. So real analytical and again, on the product side, and did a variety of different jobs and roles there at Callaway from the R&D side, but made the rare jump from the R&D side over to the commercial side of the business and really learned customers and channels and omni-channel support and managing sales forces and things like that. So really broad background, and then parlayed that into a job at a company that's built camera accessory gear, so backpacks and bags and tripods and things like that. It was distressed. I started there as chief marketing officer, trying to help them sell the company, but they ended up not selling it and holding it, and I transitioned into the CEO role there and led a pretty substantial and large turnaround and restructuring that took the company from a loss in operating income to a pretty sizable increase over a 2 or 3 year period. And so that was my first job as CEO, was really kind of baptism by fire, jumping into the frying pan, and great experience. Very tight liquidity situation, challenging global business. Was a fun one. Got done with that one in late 17, and then jumped into my most recent role as chief executive officer at a company called LÍLLÉbaby. And LÍLLÉbaby is private equity owned and is a small, lower middle market design and manufacturer of baby carriers. So, you wear your kid from infant and newborns up through even toddlers nowadays, but typically through that kind of 18 to 24 month, 2-year-old type timeframe. And so great company, founder, led, and the private equity group brought it from the founder. And so this one has been all about building the business for the next level of growth and professionalizing and installing processes and hiring, the team and things like that. It's been a fun ride. We're nearing an exit right now, which is great.
Yeah. And I know a lot of PE firms will buy companies from founders, that they serve the middle market. They like doing that's part of their strategy. Some of the things I hear from PE firms is a lot of these family held businesses don't have a lot of process in place and policies and procedures. And did you have to come in and put a lot of that into that business?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very common that those smaller founder-led businesses, they've kind of grown purely organically, right? And just people wear multiple hats and things like that. And that's part of their appeal, is you usually end up with a really strong team that can execute across a lot of different fronts, because most people do wear multiple hats. So you got to put in demand planning and stage gate product development and forecasting and reporting and analytics and things like that. Certainly if you're PE owned, they're all great things. I would say the trap, though, is over professionalizing too fast. And it's really case dependent. It depends on the culture, the category, the business, the private equity owner, but you can over process a company like that pretty quickly and lose the culture. And so there's a real challenge for a CEO to come into that environment, I think, or at least in my own experience, to find that balance between, you can turn the fire hose on, but you can't force feed the organization too fast. Otherwise, I won't say rebel, but they just can't absorb or adopt. And that's sometimes at odds with your equity owner, who has a very high clock rate, right? And then kind of a growth thesis and a plan plan to get there, right, quickly, as quickly as possible. And so the CEO's job is to balance that and really read the culture and understand what the team can absorb while satisfying kind of the projections and the thesis, of the equity sponsor, the owner. And so that's been my experience on this one. It's been an interesting ride, but it's, again, you can put as much process in place, but if people don't adopt it or if it doesn't really drive value in the business, then, in the end, it wasn't worth it. You just have to strike that balance.
Yeah, so now that's a really good point, that you don't want to just overlayer so much process and take away that entrepreneurial spirit that founder has, and then also probably permeated throughout that organization. And you don't want to be the person that comes in to crush that. It is.
That's right.
It's a real balance there. But where you are now, that was a growth opportunity. But you'd mentioned, and I can't remember which company you mentioned, where it was more of a turnaround. What was that like, being in a leadership role and a turnaround? And can you describe a little bit of the background of it?
Yeah, so it was a company that, again, we built accessories for cameras. And when the iPhone came out in 2007, you can imagine what started to happen to the camera category. And so things that attached to cameras, like cases and tripods, started to suffer, right, along with the camera business. And so significant revenue declines on top of very complex and global structure. And so the business, was overstructured for not only its current position, but kind of where it was going and it's going to settle out, with regards to size of category. And so it was, a lot of administrative work in converting, subsidiaries and unwinding subsidiaries and converting to distributorships in some tertiary and secondary markets. It was a lot of, unfortunately, reductions in force in key areas and reallocating human capital to specific areas, that required it. And key, it was about product line expansion and channel expansion. So, we used to make cases that carried things for cameras. Well, drones at the time was an emerging category, and so we started to launch a drone line. And so for cases and packs that carried drones. And that grew into a nice little business very quickly. And so it was about revenue expansion, too, in new categories and figuring out how to take what you're good at and then transfer that and move that into a new category or channel or new target consumer. And so we did that over pretty quickly, about a 12-month period. Drove a very successful result that ended in a successful exit. So it was a great ride. And I think the thing that made it work was, one, recognition by everybody of where we really were, right? Like, this was a burning platform, right? The category was a significant headwind and the company was just overstructured. And we weren't going to do this, death by 1,000 cuts. It had been doing that over the last 3 years along with kind of revenue declines, and it really required a fresh look and a total kind of structural transformation of the business, and then really being transparent through that whole process, identifying what the key activities were, and then having a lot of town halls. At some points I had a weekly town hall meeting with everybody in the company, updating them on progress. And that was really key, because even when people knew they were going away, providing that visibility and that clarity was really important and helped them execute what they needed to get done as part of the transition. And so I would say transparency through those kinds of processes is one of the most important, and communication is one of the most important things you can do as a leader.
Yeah, and especially, as you said, in those times when things are...
Yeah, in general, right, in general, it's good, but certainly in the toughest times, over-communicating, which is hard to do. Sometimes you don't have anything to say. Sometimes you can't say as much as you'd like to, but just doing a touch base even helps people, I think, feel like they're connected to the business and not just totally in the dark.
Yeah, and I can see, what you said, like death by 1,000 cuts. It's like you've got to be as decisive as you can based on the information you have at the moment to make the whatever cuts it is that you need to make. But I'll tell you, it can get hard if the company continues to decline. And I don't know if you experienced that, so that you started out with one round and then, unfortunately maybe had to do another one because the revenues kept slipping. Or were you able to kind of turn it and come up with new ways to generate revenue, so you were able to take one cut and then that was over?
It was one cut. It was one plan, but it did have phases, right? Yeah. And the key again was we made the decision to say we're going to over communicate and let people know where we're cutting, even though a certain function or area may not be reduced for 3 to 5 months out. But the risk of losing their contribution during the transition process was less than the risk of surprising them. And so, there was risk there to over communicate, but again, it worked, at least in this instance, where we had people stay through. And I think providing that transparency and visibility to their fate helped them stay engaged and work towards something, and also gave them clarity, right? I mean, it's the case in any business. Data is important even when it's bad data, right? It allows you to plan and react. The worst thing is to be in a state of unknown, and you can't work. It's hard to plan and work against a state of unknown. And so we chose in that instance to tell our people what the plan was, and we retained a large portion of the team. It wasn't like we reduced the structure by about 50%. So it was sizable. But again, it happened over a staged and kind of phased period where it was manageable, and we over communicated.
Jeff, you've had a lot of experiences. You've been in a publicly held company. You've been in a PE-backed company. I think you've been in a family or kind of single owner type company structure. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes.
So you sit you've got an interesting vantage point. I mean, do you see big differences between the three, and how would you describe them in terms of their approach to business?
Obviously, private companies have a lot more latitude with regards to disclosures and, reporting requirements and things like that, which make them simpler to run. Public companies have so much regulatory requirements as well as reporting requirements and restrictions. When you're running a public company or a senior manager in a public company, you're on a gatekeeper list, and so you can't trade right within certain periods because you have access to material knowledge and things like that. But also just even on earnings calls, you have to be careful with what you share. And certainly in private offline conversations, you have to be very careful about the information you share, with individual parties, because if it's not shared publicly, then it could provide an advantage for somebody. So a lot more constraints on the public side and a lot more work and administrative cost. That's definitely one of the advantages of being private, is you don't have to deal with all of that. There's still plenty of, normal accounting and regulatory, depending on your category. But certainly the federal regulations around reporting and the SEC and all that, and not having to deal with that is a big benefit. But look, private equity's got its own challenges too. Typically, it's the frequency and depth of reporting that it puts a big administrative load on the business. And so one of the things like I've tried to do, my company is currently private equity owned, is really, for 6 months, I worked really hard on dashboards and KPIs, and got into a rhythm then of that's the data we're pulling and reporting on, because that's what really drives the business. And so got into a cadence and a familiarity with ownership and the board that, this is what drives the business, so this is what we're going to report on. And of course you have ad hoc topics and things like that. But if you can kind of, systemically create that report, it hopefully can reduce some of the burden on the people in the business who have to pull the data and analyze it and things like that. So it's been my experience. And then, very small, family owned, you're just out there trying to land the next deal and execute, right? And it's a lot of balls, and you're juggling, usually don't have a large team. That can be very fun, but it's also got its own set of challenges, obviously. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. As I look back through my background, I've kind of covered a lot of different structures and sizes, and the grass is not greener, right? The adage is true. Every model has its benefits and its drawbacks. That's
a good perspective. So let's switch gears a little bit and just kind of talk about just at a higher level. And the question I've got for you is, what do you think a CEO needs to do to be considered a great CEO?
Great CEO. Well, the ones I've seen or worked for, obviously you got to be a motivator, and different people are motivated by different things, right? And so being able to read your team and understand how each of them as individuals are motivated, but then how are they motivated as a team? And communications. Can you inspire people? Motivate and inspire. And usually that happens through communication and being able to paint a clear vision and being convicted about that vision. And then, again, I think transparency builds trust. I haven't had a lot of CEO roles, but I feel like I'm a decent one, because I do I'm very transparent, and I use data, and that's usually the easiest way to share things with people is data. Data can diffuse an argument around opinions, and it can also lead to new answers or opportunities. It can also explain challenges, and so I try to rely on data as much as possible. So I would say great CEOs They paint a vision, they empower, and then they measure and they communicate. I think that's that's where I would put, my read on what makes a great CEO.
And what do you see as the challenges of becoming a great CEO?
Well, I think it's related. I think being able to motivating people takes work, especially if you have individuals who are motivated by different things. And that might be career progression, some might be title, some might be purely financial. And being able to read your senior leadership team and understand them as individuals, not just as a collective team, and being able to push them. Some people you can yell at and slam the table, some others you can't even look at them wrong and you'll destroy them. So, you got to kind of read the individuals, and that takes work. Being a good manager, leadership is kind of a trait, I think. You can practice leadership, I think, but you're kind of born with leadership qualities. Managing people takes time and effort. It's hard sometimes to commit the time to really manage and develop people. I think great CEOs find that time to really grow their people, and they do it by challenging them and then letting them fail in the right places where they can't hurt too much, but then also supporting them and letting them grow. That's hard to do. Most CEOs are probably kind of type A, fast clock rate, can think broadly, strategically, have grown up tactically, and jump to conclusions and answers. I know I'm guilty of this, right? I absorb data very quickly, and I'm not afraid to develop an opinion. But I've always tried to create an environment where you can talk me off a position very quickly. I love debate. I've changed my mind on things and try to create environments where people feel safe enough to do that. But not making the decision too quickly is a challenge for CEOs, I think, because they want to move forward, always moving forward and always looking for opportunity or mitigating risk. And pulling that team along with you is a challenge sometimes. It's like, come on, guys, why can't we all agree? Or this is what we're doing. Why don't you see the answer? And sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong. But I think that challenge of slowing down and making sure that you're in cadence with the rest of the organization can be a challenge that you've got to watch.
I think that is a really key point about getting to know what motivates, especially your senior team that are your direct reports. And to that point, how do you go about, when you go new into a situation, how do you go about figuring out what does motivate them? How do you build relationships with that team, given I know the time constraints that you're always under?
I think there's kind of some more systemic or process-based things. So, you set up your weekly meeting or weekly call or your update, and then you have a staff meeting. And I've always had good luck, and I think it's money well spent. If you have the chance, it's a little challenging now in COVID, or my company's 100% virtual right now, so we can't go out to dinner and share a meal. But when you break bread together and share some drinks, walls come down, relationships develop, and I've always had great success at sitting across the table in a casual setting. It's fine to talk business, but you're doing it in a setting that isn't the boardroom or the office. And I found that that's a good way to connect with people and really just kind of let the guard down and just chat. Again, you cover business, but hopefully some personal elements too, and just enjoy yourself together. Like traveling together, I found can really foster good one-on-one relationships. Going to Asia or to Europe for commercial purpose, or Asia for supply chain purpose. You can, as travelers in a foreign country, you can bond usually, and I've had good success in kind of really getting to know people via travel.
And one day we'll all be able to do that again. No,
I hope so.
We're ready. We're ready.
Yeah.
And also, just speaking specifically about one function near and dear to my heart, which is I speak with a lot of CFOs as part of my practice and background.
Sure.
They're always curious to know what they should be doing to become that. Every CFO that I know wants to become the right-hand person, an operating partner to the CEO. So from your perspective, how do CFOs go about doing that?
Great question. So my weakness, or, my least developed functional expertise area is in finance. And so I've always hired or been lucky enough to step into roles with strong CFO support, and there were controller, finance. And so the best ones for me have not just been total bean counters, pardon the cliche term. Mm-hmm. They've taken a very commercial view of the business. And so instead of just mining the balance sheet and the P&L, they get to understand the distribution and the channels and the customers and even consumers at some level. And they wear a commercial hat too. And so when a functional area head comes and asks for an incremental investment in some area, a customer asks for increased terms because they've hit a tough patch, they can certainly sympathize, if not even empathize, because they have ability to wear a commercial hat and understand the total view of the business, like the CEO has to, and not just stay stuck in the balance sheet and the P&L. And so that, to me, is the best CFOs have that, obviously, the core set of skills and the numbers down, but can take a commercial view of the business as well and communicate with the salespeople and the marketing people and be like the CEO when they're looking at a total business perspective.
I think that does differentiate it, that the CFO, as you said, you could be the bean counter, kind of doing the rear view mirror thing, but the desire and determination and drive to get out and establish relationships with all the different functions, really learn how the business operates, kind of step by step, I think they become really invaluable to the CEO, because then you truly do have an operating partner in all of that.
That's right.
So
I totally agree.
So what advice would you give to somebody who wants to become that CEO? And I can think about it in maybe two ways in terms of the life cycle of a person's career. One is, somebody who's starting out in their career kind of early on, maybe in their late 20s or early 30s, really wants to become the CEO, compared to, say, somebody who's on your direct reports team and wants to vie for that CEO position. And maybe there's no difference, but what would you suggest somebody do that does want to get that role?
Well, I think, again, CEOs are general managers, right? So you need at least working knowledge, if not command, over most areas of the business, if not all, right? You need to have a pretty strong understanding of the total operations of the business, from product design and development through supply chain, through sales and marketing, through finance and administration, IT, HR. You need to have some working knowledge, and so you can build your knowledge base. Again, I think CEOs, if you go back to what I said before, where the job is really to provide a vision, hire a team that can achieve the vision and then motivate them. You're looking for leadership traits, looking at yourself from a leader's lens. Where are your gaps? Are you comfortable communicating? Or are you communicate fine in writing, but not necessarily comfortable in public speaking? Maybe that's an area you can brush up on. I think CEOs have to be leaders. They can't just be managers. It's much better to pull people than it is to push them. And so I think, you want to be self-evaluating. Are you comfortable being a leader? Are you comfortable standing out there, taking a position, staking a claim on an idea or a project, communicating about it, and motivating people? To me, those are, again, the most important elements of being a CEO is leadership, being able to motivate people and paint a clear vision and then communicate frequently with them and be transparent. And self-deprecating, right? I think you build trust, too, by recognizing your own flaws. If you truly believe that success has a better probability or chance of being achieved through a collective effort than just you as a hero player, then you've got probably a chance of being a CEO. If you believe that that you can do it all, it's unlikely that you're going to find success, at least long term, as a CEO, is my opinion.
But it is a challenge, isn't it, especially in middle market companies, for, say, somebody who's in marketing to go get operations experience, or someone who's in finance to go get IT experience or HR. The bigger companies have career paths where they'll sit down and say, you stay here and we're going to rotate you through all these different areas. So I wonder how you go about doing that in a middle market. I guess the good news about middle market is that there's usually more flexibility. And you also get to know one another because you're kind of connected. You're closer to a connection. You know what I mean? Functionally.
That's right.
And it's, your ability to interact with all different functional leaders and people actually gives you that experience. Would you agree with that?
I think that's right. No, I think that's right, Steve. I think that's a great perspective. My experience has been that in these lower middle market type companies, you do have individuals who have worn at least multiple hats or still are wearing. That, functional silos may exist, but the walls aren't too tall still. And I think one of the ways you can provide that experience is do it on a project basis, right? So if you've got key projects that affect the entire organization and you see someone in marketing or someone in operations who might have the leadership traits and qualities, from a succession planning standpoint, or they've expressed an interest in being a general manager and a CEO someday, those are the types of opportunities that can give them better visibility cross-functionally. And so you goal that team together, not as an individual silo, but but, like a tiger team on a specific project. And it's a good way to kind of pull people together, give them that broader experience within the business.
My last question to you, Jeff, is how do you know kind of in your gut or your heart as the CEO when your team's performing well, or more importantly, when they're not performing well? Mm-hmm. How do you know that?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Obviously, you can measure the business, hopefully. So your scorecards and things like that represent overall performance. I think for me, when I think about hiring people, I have 3 I's, right? Integrity, first and foremost. Intelligence, hopefully. The third one's initiative. And to me, I know the team is engaged and doing well when they're bringing me ideas. And they're bringing problems, but they're also bringing solutions. That demonstrates a level of engagement that I think is representative of a high-performance culture, and for you to read kind of where you're at. If you're finding that you're having to ask too many questions or get updates on things or generate new ideas and you're not getting that organically from the team, you're probably not assuming that you have the right team, or at least some majority of your team is right, quote unquote right. They're not operating at, where they could be. It's that kind of idea flow and communication flow from them to you that to me represents high performance culture and output as much as it is any kind of scorecard or KPI metric, right? That's a trailing indicator anyway. It's really, are people engaged when you're talking to them? Are they excited about things? Or they have a big problem and they're asking for help, but they come to you and with a couple different pathways for solutions. That's when I think your team is engaged and performing well.
Yeah, when they're, as you said, when they're engaged and they're thinking about the business, then they're not thinking about other things, i.e. exiting the business.
Right.
Well, Jeff, listen, thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for doing this.
Sure.
Good luck on your current company and what's going on there.
Great. Thanks, Steve. I appreciate it.